Hi, Shuchi.
Morning, Sandrine. I guess
Hello.
afternoon.
I'm sorry. Good morning, David. Do you see my screen?
I do.
Okay. Will you be sharing your screen, or do you want me to share mine?
I think it's probably I will share mine,
Yes.
but I was going to talk when Jason gets on that since we're going to share the presentation when he takes over midway. I'm not sure if it's easier for me to stop and him to start, or whether he should let me continue to show the slides, but we'll see what he chooses. But I'm happy to share my screen.
Okay, I will let you share your screen then.
You want me to try just to confirm I can do it?
Yeah, please do.
Oh, I gotta close this. There we go. Oh, you have to stop for me to do it.
Okay. I haven't shared mine.
That work for you?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Okay.
Maybe I can share my screen again and...
Yep. I gave it back to you.
Okay, great. We can give 10 minutes to people to join.
I just asked Jason if he was remembered to join early. Oh, Shuchi isn't having trouble.
I see Shuchi.
Oh, there she is now. Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning, Shuchi. How are you?
Hi.
Good.
Shuchi.
I'm moving to a better lighted area. Give me one second.
Okay. Jason said he's on his way. He'll get here before we start.
Okay, great.
She left.
Maybe she will come back. You know, it's 10 minutes to the hour.
Yeah.
I will not put my camera on when you will all be speaking, okay?
Yeah, I'll turn mine off for the speakers as well.
Okay.
Do you think we need them on, or should we have them off?
You should have them on, David, when you're speaking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you will have yours, Shuchi, when you will do the intro?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
great.
And then I'll turn it off.
Okay, perfect.
How's your summer been, Shuchi?
It's been pretty good.
Have you had any summer, or are you?
Yeah, we went for a week to Utah, David, but it was super hot.
I bet, yeah.
So we didn't enjoy it as much as we should have. Plus, I had a grant deadline, so you know.
Yeah, we've had the hottest June and the wettest July on record.
You're in Boston?
Yep.
Yeah. Mhm. It's just extremes everywhere right now.
Yep.
We're in such a big drought. You guys have floods, Sandra? No.
Oh, yes.
Ew.
Belgium was badly hit. Germany was first, let's say. But in my region, it's okay, it's fine. Where my parents live, it's very bad. People lost so many things. And it's a small country, so you can imagine lots of people living in, it's...
In like together, they have to move in together or...
Yeah, the people are really collaborative, helpful, etc. So it's very nice. But it's it's the same as you also had in the States or in North America, in Canada with the fire, etc. It's
the fires.
Just crazy. And
we've been. I drove back from a summer place in New Hampshire on what's today? Tuesday, Monday evening, and you could smell the fire in the air 3,000 miles away.
Man.
And the sun was being made to look orange-like in the sky. The moon was red, all from the refracted light from the smoke.
Believe it or not, this is what our kids have seen for the past 2 years here.
Yeah.
Every fall. It's been crazy.
One of our good friends who lived in the Oakland Hills has recently sold her home and moved to New Hampshire to avoid the potential of fires again there. Not a good time, and we have COVID to boot.
It's not good. Yeah, I worry for my children. Yeah.
What's Stanford doing on COVID?
In terms of
the students coming back, and what are they requiring?
Oh, they're coming back, and they're required to be vaccinated.
They're required to be vaccinated.
Yes. And they're still going to wear masks.
Yeah.
Sandrine, just so we will have very little time. I think at some point we had talked about an hour and a half, but this is squeezed into an hour.
This is an hour. I won't be able to make it longer myself, neither. I cannot commit to. I can go 5-10 minutes after the hour, but
so I will definitely restrict myself to 5 minutes, but we'll just keep moving just so we get to let people speak towards the end too. And if the wrap up is only 1 minute, that's totally fine.
We will move as quickly as we can. We have a number of slides, but I don't think we'll spend much time on them. Are these slides made available after the presentation?
It's up to you, David. If you think it's okay, then we will. Otherwise, some people have unpublished data, etc. So then we don't.
I'll let Jason decide on that. Hi, Jason. He's muted.
Oh, hi, Jason.
Hi. Hello. What am I deciding on?
On whether we can share the presentation after the fact. There's some slides in that might be pre-publication. So
let's, if we can just have like a little bit of time to figure out what can stay and what can go. I think the majority of it can stay.
Yeah, that's not a problem. You guys.
Although the pre-publication stuff, if it just says pre-publication, I mean, like, I think the point I want to make with that last slide, aside from the thank you, David, is like nobody else has this. We have the hospital data, we've got the community follow-up ability, and we have 5 years of worker data to really figure this out.
In the data I present, we have the material from Harvest.
Welcome, Christina.
The Harvest implementation evaluation, which I don't think we've published yet.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm fine if we just put like a banner on it that says like, you know, publication, do not share outside of, you know, your own curiosity, something like that. I mean, people, I don't see the danger of it. And I don't think like, you know, we're probably going to go to BMJ with OEM. I can't see Hans like having a hissy fit that we shared it with some colleagues.
We could check ahead of time.
Yeah. But yeah, I just don't think Hans would flip out about that as an editor. He's
Jason,
cool cat, that one.
Jason, in terms of the presentation, I'm going to share my screen to show the slideshow through my portion. Would you like to switch sharing, or would you
No,
like?
let's not, because I always feel like that's a recipe for disaster. So like, why don't we just keep going? And if you don't mind, I'll just say next slide.
No, that's fine with me.
Yeah, because I always feel like that, and it'll slow the rhythm down.
Yeah.
And we have too many slides, so we're gonna have to be pretty quick.
Yep.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I appreciate trying to keep to the time. And we will probably start at 6:02. We'll start as soon as, you know, we have a sizable crowd.
We have Andy, Fire, who just joined. Yeah. Anina.
I can't see myself. Do I? Not that I really want to, but just to make sure.
You look beautiful, Jason. You look absolutely beautiful.
Long hair.
Yeah.
Yeah, the hair's getting long again.
Yeah.
Just in time for Delta, dark joke of the day.
Yeah. What just happened? Oh, I don't know. Brendan isn't on yet.
Yes, that's true.
He's lovely. Where did you find him, Shuchi?
He's part of the ACT team, the ISN ACT. And yeah.
He's great. Do I have time to run up and refill this?
I think so.
I'll be like less than.
Pointing it to everyone who joined. Thank you for joining.
Hello, thanks for
actually it's Augusto. Ania is my daughter.
Yeah, we were wondering.
So with my computer.
Well, that reminds me, I have to change my name.
Well, you know,
Sorry for that.
they have as much a right to the computer as you do nowadays.
Yeah.
Sure.
I just realized I had been named Carolyn Mugar, so I thought I should change my name too.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
We have Adira as well, Pablo, Garcia,
Hi,
Christina, Maria.
Hi, everyone.
Maria Rita, I guess.
Hi, everyone. I'm just getting a coffee. That's why my video is off.
Masomi.
I did the same. I have a really adorable sleep terrorist who actually has been sleeping 6 to 7 hours since she was born.
Wow.
Yeah, but last night she was like, not so much doing that. But man, she just is so happy while she's awake. It's hard to be upset. She's just giggling the entire time.
Yeah.
It's fun. But I definitely didn't sleep last night. That was actually, she's been so easy on us. It's fine. It's like one night.
She's becoming normal.
Yeah. Yeah, because we were like, is something wrong? We had asked the pediatrician. She's like, no, enjoy this.
Yeah.
It's like, you're very lucky.
We are still missing Brandon Smyth, who's one of the presenter. And we'll text him.
Yeah, he's great. I think we could probably do something very interesting on treatment and mitigation.
think we're going to wait until 6:02 at least.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And if, Sandrine, I'm assuming you've emailed Brendan.
Yeah, we did the same.
That's okay. That's all right. I'm pretty sure he'll join. He sent the slides so someone can present them.
Yeah, right.
I haven't thought about a step wedge design since epi school. It's not a terrible idea. It's just the amount of resources you would need to get multiple field sites. I don't know if I think the issue is funders don't have that vision, that would require a massive amount of resources.
Okay, Brendan is here.
Did a little step wedge in El Salvador.
Yeah. I mean, that was because of gang violence.
Yeah, right.
Gang violence induced step wedge design. Yeah, I mean, we could do it. But just like every one of these sites is almost cost prohibitive and time consuming because of the relationships you have to keep going to make any of it work.
Hey, Brendan.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sandrine. Jason, David. Hello.
Good to see
Good morning, Brendan.
Brendan.
Good evening.
Yeah, for
Good
you.
evening.
Yeah. Are you in lockdown?
Yeah, we've gone into lockdown. Just a year later than the rest of the world. Pretty much.
All right, I think we should get started because it's a tight agenda. So Sandrine, would you like to start?
You can. Hi, everyone. We'd like to welcome all of you to joining this interactive meeting. So, as you know, this will be on intervention and trials methodology for occupational and environmental assessment in endemic communities. We'll first have Shuchi introducing this meeting, and it will be followed by a presentation from Jason Glaser and David Wegman on intervention for CKDU during the Adelante Initiative. And then we'll have an overview of trials in occupational health settings by Brandon Smyth. And we will end with an open discussion as well as a conclusion.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. If you don't mind, may I share my screen to highlight what we've been up to since the last meeting?
Can you share your screen?
Yep. Okay, so I know there are some people here who are new, and so welcome to new members. And just an update for people who've been around for some time in our prior meetings as well. So you're joining the ISN Consortium of Collaborators on CKDU, or I3C, and this is our internal webinar. We've had both internal and sort of larger ISN-wide webinars. And this is sort of the mission. We have a 3-pillar mission of building consensus, working on guidelines, and discussing, and this is part of sort of working on guidelines, but also discussing ongoing research and thinking about methodologies and approaches for CKDU research. And we're working on, we have an advocacy arm as well, working on supporting patients with CKDU. And we have 2 guideline papers published. If people need references, here they are. They're on population level detection and methodologies for approaching cause investigations in CKDU. In the first paper, we proposed a minimum data set, and in the second, we have tapped into many experts to try to come up with a range of potentially sophisticated techniques to apply for investigations. And then we've had a couple of webinars within our meetings, within I3C, as the pandemic has rolled on. One looked at sort of the ongoing surveillance or cross-sectional design studies to investigate sort of like the epidemiology of CKDU, and the others are looked at cohorts to try to describe how people are approaching recruiting patients for long-term investigations, and especially in the time of COVID, what the challenges they faced. And then we also have, after discussing amongst ourselves the biopsies, kidney biopsies are an essential tool for investigation, supported content to support kidney biopsies. And this content was led by Suman Behara and Pablo Garcia, both excellent nephrology fellows at different institutions. And it's uploaded to the ISN Educational Academy now. And we had a sort of a larger ISN-wide webinar to discuss this and to discuss challenges with kidney biopsies in lower resource settings. That was nicely contributed to by Vicente Sanchez Polo and Marla McKnight. This was part of the presentation and part of what's uploaded to the Educational Academy. People are looking for this, looking at all the steps of a kidney biopsy, including down to sort of ultrasound guided images and tissue evaluation. We've also continued to maintain with Sandrine and Maria Rita and Pablo Garcia, who's our I3C fellow, our ISN observatory. And there is a new website available where you can access more details about the observatory, as well as uploaded new data on people who've been kind enough to submit what they're doing, the type of high level summary of the type of work they're doing. And then we have attempted, are planning to embed questions related to CKDU in the Global Kidney Health Atlas to try to ascertain regions where nephrologists, practicing nephrologists, thought leaders, policymakers think that there is a larger than expected and unexpectedly large prevalence of kidney disease in their region. And so we're working on that with assistance from the ISN research group to try to embed a larger surveillance or survey of potential additional hotspots for chronic kidney disease that is unexplained. I wouldn't necessarily define it as CKDU, but unexplained high prevalence chronic regions. And that's it. And today we're having another webinar, this time focused around interventions. And we have two people who have been working on interventions for some time now and presenting their work, presenting the challenges and successes, which is David Wegman and Jason Glaser, working through the Adelante Initiative. And we'll also have Brendan Smyth from the ACT group, from the ISN ACT group, discuss some potential methodologies that could be relevant as we think about interventions for CKDU. I do think the last time when we met, there was a sense, I hope, that you got from some communities that, perhaps some of our epidemiology and investigations ought to be performed within a framework of an intervention, as populations have gotten fatigue from enrolling in a lot of observational study without concrete action for their health. So that's it, and I look forward to today's webinar.
This is David Wegman. Thank you, Shuchi and Sandrine, for the introduction. And I'm going to run through a presentation talking about how we've addressed an intervention study in Nicaragua with particular attention to the fact that we believe we need to try to do something, even if we have incomplete knowledge, and then study what we're trying to do. So this will be an issue relevant to the problems of epidemiology in the face of uncertainty. I'll present the first half, followed by Jason Glaser, who will cover the issues of that have to do with implementation. So an overview of our presentation, just a brief comment on what is CKDnt or U, as Shuchi was saying earlier. Our attention to the particular agent heat stress and its assessment and its role in CKDU, our approach to intervention and the preliminary results from that. We've been involved in the study now for 4 years, going on 5, and the early results we have COVID interfered. And then most importantly, a discussion of the intervention challenges that we've had throughout this. So just in simple summary, the difference between CKD and CKDnt or CKDU is that CKDU has disproportionately working age males as compared to older people with more likely hypertension or diabetes as an etiologic factor. Risk factors tend to be in the younger group, strenuous labor without sufficient access to water, rest, and shade that we've observed and are trying to attend to. And the disease, while not absent, while proteinuria is not absent, the dominant feature is increased serum creatinine with only minor proteinuria. We've seen variations on this in Central America, South Asia, and other tropical lowlands, but we are attending to the study in Central America. So first, heat strain. What do we mean by this? Basically, we've been concerned in looking at our workforce that there's this combination of environmental heat, where work is done in quite warm circumstances, piecework pay, which requires workers to work faster than they might otherwise choose to in order to obtain an adequate, or even an inadequate income for the period of the harvest in these sugarcane plantations, which leads to internal heat from muscular work combined with personal risk factors to result ultimately in greater physical strain and the risk of hyperthermia, which we believe is critical to the onset of CKDU. With these risks, greater health risk, increased accident risk, which we tend not to think much about. And then also of interest to the plantations we work with is reduced productivity associated with problems resulting from the heat stress. Give you a little bit of an example of the kind of environment these people are working in, covered with the soot from burned cane, and you can see the sweat marked back. How do we estimate heat strain? We're trying to focus on the connection between both internal and external heat exposures. The average core temperature of burned cane cutters that I was just showing you a picture of, this is a summary of a sample done over the course of a day. And you can see that the distribution early in the day exceeds 38 degrees, which is the core body temperature control area that the occupational health standards focus on. And then at the same time, we have environmental temperatures exceeding the OSHA guidelines. This line here, 15, means once it reaches this level, you should have 15 minutes rest each hour. And if it's as high as 33 roughly, there should be no work. And you can see that increase occurs more gradually in the day than the onset in the acclimated cane cutters from core body temperature around 36.5 rapidly increases to 38 in that population. The maximum predicted core temperature in the groups that we've studied shows that the cane cutters and seed cutters, two different kinds of cutting being done in the field, on average exceeds the core temperature of 38 degrees, while the drip irrigators, a different group that's doing irrigation work at lower physical demand, does not exceed the body temperature, which is a nice, for us, comparison group. How do we intervene on this if our hypothesis is that heat strain results in kidney damage? Our key objective is to reduce this distribution of internally generated heat below 38 degrees centigrade Celsius. How do we do that? We do it with a combination of what we call water rest and shade plus sanitation. So we need adequately scheduled breaks for a duration sufficient to allow recovery, shade tents to allow rest to be in outside of the sun, protection from the sun, adequate hydration with clean water and hydrating drink available throughout the workday, and then adequate sanitation, because if there isn't adequate sanitation, women in particular will not take adequate water in order to avoid having to urinate during the course of the workday. So here's an example of the kinds of shade tents that we have in the field, and you can see that we can move them as the work moves through the harvesting period. We try to limit the number of people in the tent so that there's adequate amount of space for people to relax and rest. And that's where we also maintain the water and the electrolyte that workers have access to throughout the day. Hydration, you can see that this can up here is, I'm sorry about this, very sensitive cursor here. This can is what is carried by the workers through the day, and then they refill it from a central reservoir as they come back for their breaks, and also have a chance to use the electrolyte solution. It's essential to have this move with the workers, otherwise they won't come back to to have clean water. And also setting up sanitation in the field so that workers can comfortably relieve themselves and get adequate attention to their needs so that they will hydrate. We are in this whole process worried about continuous improvement by making objective clear to all. It's not simple to do all these changes in the work setting and make it possible for the workers to continue to earn what they need to earn. This is an example of the workers being outfitted with a polar heart rate monitor to estimate core body temperature. And we continuously try to study and improve the intervention elements that Jason will speak about in a moment. Here's some preliminary results to give you an indication of why we feel positive about this. When we watch the existing rest and hydration schedules impact on this workforce, the burn cane cutters had end harvest kidney injury defined as greater than 0.3 milligrams per deciliter or greater than 1.5 times increased baseline to end harvest. 27%, including dropout assessment, showed this evidence of kidney injury. 9% of key seed cutters and only 2% of the irrigation and field support workers. Given this, we thought there had to be a change in the nature of the rest, both duration and timing in the field. So after this harvest one, when we just observed the existing schedule, we began to increase earlier in the day and duration of rest so the workforce could have a better opportunity to recover from the demands of this work. We looked after the end of the harvest and we noticed a dramatic drop in the burn cane cutters, but the seed cutters seemed to not change, and we wondered about why this had not happened. As we looked at the assessment of 3 different working groups within the seed cutter category, the assessment from the from both us and the and Ingenio, the plantation, was that kidney injury in the best implemented group was down to 2%, like the drip irrigation repair, while those with intermediate implementation were 10% and the worst were 21%. which indicated to us that it wasn't just a matter of getting these into the field, but making sure they were adequately implemented. When we looked at our observations along the ISA as the ingenio that where they're doing the study, while we had different percents of estimates of deficient or needs improvement of the implementation, we both agreed pretty well that there were significant improvements necessary. In the third harvest, we increased further the duration and earlier the rest periods to enhance the amount of recovery time for the individuals, now almost a quarter of the day. Yet we still have to struggle with the barriers that we have to making this an adequate implementation of an intervention, which in theory could reduce heat stress, but in practice is problematic. So Jason, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is you're dealing with a 35,000 hectare sugar mill with thousands of workers in a place where nobody was doing really anything to protect people for over 100 years, just started to a few years ago, really in the big picture. And so it's real systemic change that's happening. It seems obvious to all of us, but it was not happening. And it's not happening in several industries. So it's certainly not just sugar, but sugar is the dominant monoculture in the lowlands of Mesoamerica. And that's where we've seen such high incidence of disease. So that's why we focus there. So, you know, when I have to do these talks at like a corporate conference of like sustainability, you know, they always want you to come and talk about what you're doing to protect supply chains. And the question I always get, which I find is frankly very venal and banal, is what's the ROI on saving lives? And the news is it's positive. There's greater retention, there's less need to buy new equipment. We did this analysis with the German Development Bank, the DEG, and the University of Texas's Ray Marshall Center. So it's a positive ROI, and we reduce the incidence of kidney injury, but that's not enough to drive change. I mean, that's enough to understand why change is a good idea, but people and organizations appear to be a bit more complicated. So next.
ROI is return on investment.
Oh, sorry, yeah,
no.
I forgot I'm not talking to a bunch of sustainability experts, talking to normal people. So sorry about that. So organizational assessment, we brought in a team from Gothenburg University, and this is also one of the things I studied in my master's at London School in epidemiology, is organizational management. We really tried to figure out how can we identify at different levels of management what the barriers are, what the opportunities are, and to really get this integrated into just how business is done. To put this in the rearview mirror, this should not be such an effort. This should just become the norm of production, right? Providing these very basic things for people's health, like fresh water, potable water, shade and rest when it's 40 degrees Celsius. These things need to just become the norm. What we had seen in different permutations of our work is if not all of these groups are aligned, nothing will get done. You can have the management fully aligned, but if middle management or supervisors are not, or the workers are not, things will not play out as you intend. So we didn't want to make that mistake this time and brought in a group for analysis. Next. So with top management, there's barriers. They were still, until recently, they've shifted this. We're managing on the traditional metrics of productivity. They weren't considering health and well-being as a metric. They are now. It's about 20% of people's review is on health outcomes of the workforce because they believe that this work is reducing the incidence of hospitalizations due to heat stroke and the AKI that they're detecting, as well as the cross-harvest and cross-shift kidney injury that they look for as well, and that we're looking at. There's also just limited bandwidth. The opportunities we saw is they accepted the return on investment, and they, back in the old days, they were not always the easiest group to work with, but they had new leadership come in, and there seems to be an honest desire to want to be the leader in the region. And so they've actually changed their management metrics, which is promising. Next. So heads of areas, heads of like occupational safety and health, heads of things like human resources. We had a real deficit of interface with the human resource office. There also was a big conflict of metrics between the occupational safety health office and the human resource teams, meaning HR was measuring on what HR measures on, like how much did you produce? Were you absentee? These were the things that supervisors and workers were measured on, and OSH was trying to measure on like how many people have we referred to the clinic this week, how many people have collapsed in the field, how many people have had an injury. So what we've created is a more integrated management system. So when people are reviewed, they're reviewed on these things. Even when that first went into place though, there was a period of, I know that you know that I know that this is just blah, 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 and you're really just measuring me on my productivity metrics. So they had to do education in their own workforce of like, no, you're being measured on this as well. This is part of your review. So that's really an interesting shift. I think that's pretty unique in the region. And those of you know David Michaels, he would be happy that they're actually measuring on safety. Next. So general supervisors, you know, I think that, again, it's just kept coming down to this conflict between production ends and health metrics. And that's gotten to the point now where the supervisors and the OSH and HR team are thinking about not getting rid of piece rate completely, which we would like to see, but it's a pretty important first step, is they want to put a limit on how much people cut so they don't cross a threshold of exhaustion. So it's a step in the right direction. I would say just get rid of piece rate and pay people by day, because I think the piece rate is what's a classic perverse incentive, but they are starting to think through it. There's also task overload. You know, they're out there trying to maintain productivity, maintain safety, manage the logistics of moving teams over 35,000 hectares or 70,000 hectares, and the outgrowers, the other farms that support the mill. So there was also a real tendency to kind of victim blame, like, oh, the workers aren't taking it seriously. And we found that just wasn't the case. The workers were all about it because their productivity has actually gone up, not down, or at least stabilized with the intervention. So that was a lot of bias that was going on there. But it seems to be improving. There's a real sense of pride in the program, and they want to see a success. And then the next slide. Health promoters are the folks that are attached to each cutting front. So the fronts are basically designed, divided by bus load. They have these old like US school buses that transport the workers to the fields. And there's about 60 workers per bus. And each kind of platoon or frente, they're called, has a health promoter attached to them. And, you know, same thing, that they just keep coming back to that issue of what's my role? What am I really being measured on? And I have too much to do. But we've been able to address that, it seems, as well as we go on. And the last one I think is kind of the most interesting for the workforce and gets into piece rate. And then next as well, will pop up the earnings. So these folks, like the average wage, the living wage in Nicaragua is supposed to be about $3,600 a year. And you can see that workers, when we did an economic study in the community, are not making that, despite working very long hours, working very hard 6 days a week. They're not even making what's considered the living wage. So you have this piece rate, which is a really perverse incentive. They're also responsible, or were responsible, for primarily moving all of their protective equipment, the tents, the water coolers, et cetera. So they're being told, you have to cut this, but you have to move this. And we saw that play out pretty negatively a couple times in year 2. Still, it seems to be getting better in year 3, where people are all pitching in on the field. And you know, there's real opportunity to just keep engaging them. They're quite keen to understand why this is happening, what the impact is. And there's a few technologies now that everybody has a cell phone in their hand, even in these impoverished communities. We can communicate through different software and keep people up to date. And that's a really interesting opportunity. And we're just trying to relieve that task overload and let them focus on their job and make others really responsible for looking after their health. I mean, it's their responsibility to, you know, drink water and drink the electrolyte solution, but they shouldn't be worried about like moving their tents and keeping things close. They need to focus on a fairly dangerous job as it is. So I think there's a lot that's going wrong here still, that's structural and systemic and not limited to this area. This is every commodity I can think of. You got this perverse piece rate situation, and you've got people that are just not paid sufficiently for the work they do. Next. Concerns and considerations. You know, I think the thing when we came out with the first study last year it was last year, was people are like, oh, they only reduced the incidence of disease or injury by 72%. There must be another cause. And I found that really curious. Maybe there is. We haven't seen it in the blood work or the urine work. The water they drink has been fine for a decade. We've had that tested at the old source and the new source, both are potable. I think people, it would really help us to think about like how difficult it is to implement these things. This isn't a clinic, this isn't a hospital, this is a big functioning, I would say formally dysfunctional organization that has only taken upon itself to really protect its workforce and evaluate that in the last 5 to 7 years is a full commitment. So implementation is really the name of the game. And then if we get implementation up to a decent level and we still see this, I'd be more interested in covariates or interactions. Next. But we weren't making it easy on anybody. These were our formulas for the old intervention management. So we've streamlined this. I mean, we overthought it. We got way too academic about it. Derision accepted. Next. But I wanted to talk about kind of like why we're here, why we're all here, I think. I mean, the group, what is it? There's 27 of us that showed up today. I think everybody here is concerned about these folks on the ground and what we can do in the absence of full certainty about etiology. I mean, if it's something in the environment, we need to provide people with potable water, right? We shouldn't have planes flying over them spraying chemicals. Those things are things we've worked with the mill on as it stands. And then we know that heat stroke derived kidney injury can lead to chronic tubular interstitial nephritis. That's not news, that's old understanding. So if we can at least mitigate those risks for other covariates interactions, I think it's a positive. And I think this group is kind of, I hope, as fatigued as the rest of us are about some of these conflicts we've seen emerge in the journals. Like nobody has all the answers, but we need to act now with what we're able to. And we can see we better start now because just introducing solutions is not enough. Like you've really got to learn how to work with everybody from workers to CEOs in this setting anyway, to get a real shift. But this guy is already sick. He's in his late 20s. He's got 2 kids, 1 more on the way. And what does this do? This means kids go replace their parents in the workforce in the subcontracted farms because somebody's got to be a primary earner, and you're removing these guys out of their prime earning ages. So you're really keeping everybody down in a system of poverty. Next. There are aid packages for ex-workers that are older that came through the World Bank, but a lot of the younger ex-workers are not aided by these programs, and the dialysis treatment is not ideal. This is in someone's home, out in the countryside, very hard to keep it hygienic. He's in his early 30s, absolutely lovely couple. But he's in dire straits, and he's in his early 30s as a cane cutter. These guys are older, and both were cane cutters. Next, you can see the hemo fistula. This guy's already passed away, Ramon, he's gone. His dad is gone, and just again, this whole cycle that we really need to interrupt. If we can buy time, I think that's what we need to go for. We might not be able to stop this in its tracks completely with these interventions, but we do seem to be slowing down injury. Next. And then I would really like to see what we can do about this situation. I think the home treatment situation, and that Baxter keeps pushing this in communities that are clearly not set up to manage this. And we have data on fungal peritonitis, things like 25% mortality every 6 months in the cohort that was given to us by a Baxter nurse serving these people. Something has to be done at ISN about this. This is not acceptable. So I'm kind of throwing that grenade into the room. I don't think any of us are okay with this. This is a norm. This isn't an exception in these communities. Next. Yeah, again, this cycle, these are 2 guys in their 20s gone, mother's left, husband's gone. So it's really essential that we get this right. Like we got to keep reiterating and see as much of the risk as we can reduce and try to limit the damage that we're seeing as much as possible and get that implementation up so we can really assess it to make sure that our design is sufficient if the implementation becomes sufficient. That's the only way we're going to know if the design is okay. I think we have a bit to go. I'm quite encouraged, so I'm about to show you some pretty cool data. This is a nice mapping study that was done. You'll see some of those outliers of cane up in the north. These are heavily mechanized areas dependent on mechanization and migrant work. But the areas where you have like local workers, it's pretty clear, the overlap. Industrialized cane in the lowlands, there's something to this workload issue. Next. It's another animation. So what can we do? I think over the next harvest, hopefully relatively COVID-free, but it's looking dicey now with Delta. We really need to focus on implementation, and we have papers coming out on that soon. I think we have to coordinate our different entry points. We have a new program going with the Department of Labor and World Vision that's very similar at 2 mills in Tierra Blanca and Veracruz and Oaxaca in Mexico. And it's important that we learn from that setting. So the setting's very different. The work is similar, but the setting and the way the work is organized is quite different. So it's going to be a new set of challenges. And each one of these programs is probably $1 million a year between the collection, the analysis of the data, the biobanking. So getting multiple sites is nothing, not a small thing. And finding funders that want to focus on risk mitigation is also no small thing. Next. So this is the data I kind of wanted to leave us with. This is very crude. I just analyze, put this together this weekend. I won't even say analyze, but we got access to hospitalized acute kidney injury that the OSH team at the mill has said they believe is due to people that have had heat stroke events. And you can see that those with the heaviest workload had the highest risk every year. But I think what's more interesting, if you go to the bottom, as the intervention started in H1, Harvest 1, where we just observed, it was still quite high overall and per group. And I think the other thing is, I don't think most of us would have thought that 10% of a workforce, 7% of a workforce was having hospitalized heat stroke with kidney injury. I think it's much higher than we certainly thought. And it's much higher than any of us thought that there's this much heat stroke happening, even at a mill that had an intervention that first year, just an insufficient one. And as things have improved over the years, you see this further reduction of the hospitalized AKI. So this is quite hopeful, and it also provides us an opportunity to look at who had AKI in the hospital and see what their outcomes were back in 2018. And we think we can go even further back. They're open to opening up that data to us, and then follow in our cohort and our ability to go into the communities and follow people up for people that have dropped out of the cohort and see what that impact has been on their disease status. Do those that have had hospitalized AKI have a higher incidence of having end-stage renal disease, CKD or CKDnt? It's a real opportunity. Doors open for those that might want to collaborate on that. I don't know of any other group that kind of has that set up where we have the hospital data, we have the community access throughout the region, and then we also have this, now a 5-year cohort that we've been very successful in following up dropouts. So it's really hopeful. Thanks a lot. I hope this has been useful for you, and we'll go over to Brendan.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Yeah, no, thank you, Jason. That was fantastic. And thank you to David as well, and to Shuchi and Sandrine for inviting me. My name's Brendan Smyth. I know many of you on the call, but certainly not all. I'm a nephrologist based in Sydney, Australia, and I work at the University of Sydney. My PhD was finished last year, and that was mainly focused on randomized trials and in the dialysis population. And I have also worked with the ISN ACT group, setting up the clinical trials toolkit. So, right. We'll just cover a sort of general overview of challenges in studies in this area. And I should say up front that I'm not an expert at all and don't have any direct experience with CKDU. It's not something that's recognized in Australia, but this has made me wonder about our local region, the Pacific Islands and places like that where there's no data to determine whether it is an issue. We'll have a look at some of the key questions that study designers need to consider, non-randomized, randomized studies and other aspects, and some resources that might help. So, I mean, as you can tell from the information that David and Jason have given, there's a lot of challenges to working in this space. The disease itself, you've got transient changes that may be difficult to capture. Meaningful changes in chronic kidney disease can take a long time to develop, so you might need to follow participants in a study for years. And we don't have good surrogate markers. Proteinuria might appear in some cases, but not all. And so you're then looking at potentially fluctuating or long-term changes in serum creatinine, which is hard to follow. It's a very localized disease, so it's concentrated not just in particular geographical areas, but in particular socioeconomic groups, which again makes study difficult. And there are, of course, the social factors that Jason so eloquently explored with the marginalization in these communities. They're low resource areas, and there really isn't the research or even the clinical infrastructure that many of us are used to relying on. And so sort of where to start? I mean, the traditional way you approach something like this, or the way the textbooks might say, is that you start by defining a disease, then describe its epidemiology and natural history, identify the causes, and then study how you might ameliorate those. But I think, realistically, we can and should do all of these things at once. Disease definitions can change over time. Describing the natural history can be done partly from what we learn from studies that might have an interventional focus. Similarly, with identifying causes, you can learn a lot from knowing what does and doesn't work. So I think these things should move in parallel, influencing one another along the way. So when we're thinking about designing an interventional study for CKDU, obviously the first question is what design? Parallel group studies, crossovers, case control. Are you going to be studying the individual or studying groups? And as Jason has said, the ability to get multiple different clusters or sites together can be really challenging. Do you randomize? Do you take a pragmatic or a more detailed explanatory approach? What endpoints do you look at? And then, of course, the sort of ethical and cultural considerations that need to inform your study design. And so, I've sort of said here that, look, yes, if you're going to do a study of any intervention, randomization is always best. But of course, the big caveat there is that it's often not possible or not feasible. It does permit known and unknown confounders to be balanced. And so, things like trends over time or differences between different work sites can hopefully be worked out with randomization. Whether you choose to randomize depends partly on what you're actually attempting to study and what your intervention is. I think if you would take sort of, the examples that we've just seen where the intervention is simply the provision of shade and water, then it's, less important to randomize, given that, that shade and water is not likely to be harmful. Whereas if you're looking for an intervention that's particularly burdensome on the agricultural workers or is particularly costly, or may have some risk, then randomization becomes more important to provide that higher level of evidence. And it's also important just to remember unintended consequences. The snippet from a paper there of trying to kill spiders with a blowtorch that didn't go very well, that it doesn't have to be that dramatic. There was an interesting study just earlier this year looking at, now a very different setting from CKDU, but for automated alerts for AKI in hospitalized patients, which you'd think would be a low risk sort of no-brainer. You just automatically present the clinician with an e-alert when their patient has acute kidney injury. But there was actually a signal for harm in this randomized study. So you just don't quite know always what you might actually, how an intervention may change the way the natural history of the disease develops. So if you're going with a non-randomized study, it's important to really consider very carefully what your control group is. And if you're using historical controls, are you measuring the endpoint in the same way at each time so that you're not introducing observation bias? If you're using a contemporaneous comparator group, or how similar is that to the intervention group? If it's a before and after study, do you have good data before the study started in order to provide an adequate comparison? And are you controlling for the effects of time as things change? It's important to consider all the possible confounders. And so, ideally, the more information you have, the more likely you're going to be able to be to identify and potentially account for statistically confounders. And as an example, this recent study looked at sort of an artificial intelligence and mHealth-driven acute kidney injury pathway. Again, this is in hospitalized patients. And what the authors did was it was a non-randomized study. They had 2 sites, the Royal Free in London and a comparator site also in London, another hospital. But what they were able to do is compare the trends over time. So having the data of, this is sort of the kidney injury recovery rate over time before and after the implementation. The intervention was implemented in the top hospital here. They're able to see a change in the trend. So they can look at the regression line and then the difference between the slope of the regression line before and after, which provides a higher level of evidence than if you simply had 1 or 2 time points before and after. And when you're looking at randomized studies, your questions come down to whether you're actually randomizing an intervention to an individual or to a cluster. And I would imagine that in the CKD space, it's usually to a cluster if you're looking to change the way something's done at a work site or at a clinic. But you also, of course, need to consider whether you go for a parallel group crossover or the stepped wedge design. We'll talk a little bit more about each of those. I think in the occupational health space, cluster randomization is more frequently used. And I know this will be familiar to a lot of the people on the call, but the next few slides go over this in some detail. In cluster randomization, you're not randomizing the individual patient or worker. You're randomizing their work site or a clinic. So it's groups of individuals that are being randomized rather than individuals themselves. And this is great for interventions that are applied to a group. If you're providing shade and water, it's not practicable to, probably not ethical either, to only allow certain people on the work site to access that shade and water. So if you cluster randomize, then different people at different sites are exposed to the change or not, and you can compare them. The weaknesses of this, though, of course, is that you do have to consider the differences between the clusters. And so if you've just got, 2 or 3 sites, that might not be enough because each site is different and works in a slightly different way or a very different way in some cases. Where this can be examined statistically using an intercluster coefficient, and that helps you to balance the results. But where that intercluster coefficient is quite high, you're going to need more sites. There are other ways to stratify the randomization or to randomize in a way that helps you to achieve balance between the 2 groups. And so as an example, you can do huge cluster randomized studies. So this is the China salt substitution study involving 600 villages in 5 provinces in China. The intervention here is that villages randomized to receive sort of regular deliveries of a low sodium salt substitute. It's essentially a mix of a bit of potassium in addition to sodium. So it reduces the sodium intake. And what the way this study is designed is that, you don't have to look at everybody in the village. Each village they select 30 to 40 high-risk individuals who are then followed. And so that idea of, if you're wanting to implement a study in CKDU, maybe you don't need data on all of the employees, but if you have a representative sample of employees that can provide you with, essentially the same information and perhaps at a lower cost. This particular salt substitution study is ongoing, and they've got some early data that looks promising with a reduction in blood pressure. But of course, your studies don't have to be that big. I mean, this is another cute little study that came out just earlier this year looking at implementing intradialytic cycling in dialysis units. And so they only had 3 dialysis units, and they split the units by shift. So that gave you 6 clusters and randomized them to participate in intradialytic cycling or not. The adherence was sort of 70%. And as sort of Jason mentioned, this is often a problem, and it dilutes the treatment effect. But in a sense, that's also part of what you're examining. I mean, realistically, you're never going to get 100% adherence to most interventions. And so demonstrating the ability to generate an effect with incomplete adherence is important knowledge. And this study showed that they were able to reduce the left ventricular mass, so it's essentially reducing the left ventricular hypertrophy or an improvement in the heart structure with intradialytic cycling. Then the final design that we'll talk about is a stepped wedge design, so otherwise known as a randomized sequential crossover study. In this design, it's a cluster study, but you randomize the order in which the sites transition from pre-intervention to post-intervention. And the advantages here are that all participants or all sites receive the intervention. So you're not leaving people out, everybody gets it. You can naturally roll out the intervention over time, over different sites. And for a given intercluster coefficient, or I suppose for a given inter-site variability, the step wedge design has greater power, because what you're able to do is compare the same site to itself before and after the study in that crossover design, which increases your power. You still have the potential for bias from underlying temporal trends. If you study like this example running for 85 weeks, if the natural history of the disease is changing over that time or local practice is changing, then that might undermine your effect. But it's a potentially powerful tool. In Australia, the reduction study's just been completed. 37 dialysis services were randomized to a bundle of dialysis catheter care measures. So again, trying to reduce the risk of catheter infections. And they went with a cluster design, particularly because you're looking at things that are done sort of habitually by the nursing staff to everybody at the unit. And they weren't entirely sure which aspect of the intervention is most efficacious. So you're implementing a bundle of things. And so bundle them together, and that's your intervention there. And it's a step wedge design with a baseline data collection phase where they learnt more about the study's participating sites and use that time to develop the intervention, or to ensure they sort of felt they had the intervention that would be most palatable to the participating sites. And then you can't see the stepped phase here, but they stepped in 3 waves. They had the sites commence the intervention, and a bit of extra data collection afterwards. And this study should hopefully be published later this year. But again, it doesn't have to be 37 sites in a high-income country. This step wedge design was used for the Nepal Cook Stove Intervention Project, where a group, I think there's a US Nepalese partnership, looked to try and reduce pollution within the home by installing ventilated biomass stoves that don't produce as much particulate matter. And so they identified clusters of households in a number of Nepalese villages, and sort of moved through installing these stoves. And what they looked at was pregnancy complications. They were interested to see whether there was a reduction in being born small for gestational age, premature birth, things like that. And so again, you're applying an intervention to a whole group, that is, a whole household, but you're looking at the outcomes in only a sample of that household, in this case, women, pregnant women in particular. Now, this study found that they could reduce particulate matter pollution, although they didn't show a significant effect on birth outcomes. But again, this sort of thing shows feasibility. You need to consider, of course, your outcome, and in CKDU that can be challenging because you've got a slowly moving target like creatinine or albuminuria, which we know is related to outcomes, but is not a prominent feature of this disease. And so you might be interested in other outcomes, like hospitalization rates or rates of AKI or time off work. Consider when you're choosing your outcome, how variable that outcome is and how reliable it is when you're trying to measure it. If you're measuring using surveys, are the people who are surveying the participants blinded? Could they subtly influence the data that you receive? Consider, of course, and I'm sure everybody in this forum would already be doing this, but to think of the clinical relevance and the patient importance. So, if your outcome is a 5-point change in creatinine, well, does that really mean anything? But if your outcome's actually time off work, well, that's profoundly important to people, particularly people doing piecework. Try and wrap up quickly. One thing I'd throw in here is a salivary urea dipstick. I don't know if this has ever been sort of used in the CKDU context, but there's a bit of data in African populations. I think this was a study from Malawi, where Roberto Pequat investigated the use of this cheap and quick test for uremia. Now, it's not particularly sensitive, but potentially this is the sort of screening test that could be useful in some populations, such as agricultural workers. And then finally, just ensure to engage with the community, which, again, I'm sure everyone who's interested in this area is well aware of the importance of engagement. Bring on community representatives onto steering committees if possible. Ensure that any documentation you're providing is tested with the people that you're working with. You want to make sure that they understand what they're being asked to consent to. And conduct pilot studies. They give you crucial information about how feasible your intervention is going to be, what problems you might have to anticipate, and how you might have to change tack. And then in terms of funding, there's a lot of places to look for funding, but might be a hard slog, but it can be done. The bottom line there of don't be afraid to put yourself forward, I think is important. If you don't ask, you won't get funding. Try and build up your argument through thinking about how the funding agency is going to view your proposal, and collaborate as well. If you have, or if you don't have skills in a particular area, find people who do. There are always people willing to help and get involved. And I'll skip over that and just complete now just with resources. I'll point out a few, like the ISNX Clinical Trials Toolkit, which, although it's particularly focused on randomized trials, has a lot of information and resources that people may find useful. There's guidance documents on measuring outcomes produced by the FDA, which are technical but can be useful. And this textbook, Field Trials of Health Interventions, is excellent. You can find it either just by Googling it, or we link to it with the Clinical Trials Toolkit, and it's particularly aimed at the sort of community style health interventions that CKDU work might be focused on. So we'll leave it there, and hopefully now we've got some time to talk and discuss. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Brendan, and thank you for everyone who can stay to have a discussion. We appreciate it. And I'm actually going to pass the mic to Adira to sort of help us frame the discussion. And anyone else who wants to speak, please just unmute yourself and we can discuss.
So yeah, so thanks, David, Jason, and Brendan. I think these are important discussions for us to have. I think Jason and David certainly highlighted the challenges and the complexity, and many of you will know about the notion of complex adaptive environments and experiments. That really is what we're talking about, where it isn't about one thing causing the condition, nor is it about one thing being addressed to fix the condition. And to learn as we go is really important. I think what we're trying to do through this sharing is ideally come up potentially with a set of principles or guidance of what is a good way to study a question and what is not a good way to study a question. What are the data that are needed to have the compelling arguments versus what data will not necessarily contribute to that. And I think it's really important. And Jason and David's presentation certainly pointed out very clearly this whole concept of the environment matters. Like the environment in which you are will also lead you to what are the, not only the questions, but how do you frame the answers in a way that the people understand to keep on going. And I think, Brendan, you gave us some good concepts. I mean, point of care testing to make things cheaper and easier, put the power in both the patient and the people's hands, looking at compare and contrast. Like one of the things is that as we've done this sort of collaboration, we discover that, you know, this condition, where it's biopsiable, does seem to have similar biopsy features, but very different environmental propagants. And so the same intervention may not work, but the same methods of studying those interventions should be applicable. And I think that's really one of the real goals of this collaboration. So I appreciate that for some of you, it's very late, Brenda, for the people in the Southern Hemisphere especially. But I think that what Shuchi and I wanted to do is make sure that we actually had a conversation, at least for the next 10 minutes or so, even if it's to figure out how do we take the information that Brendan gave us and Jason and David gave us, and what do we do with it to go forward to really kind of flesh this out. So maybe I'll open it up for some questions or comments.
I just have two really quick comments on the front end. One thing that we didn't talk much about, and I think David mentioned in a slide, and I know Brendan would agree, loss to follow-up in these situations is so important, because if you look at a lot of the occupational studies published to date and a lot of the community studies to date, there's this large amount of lost follow-up. And you saw on that one slide how important it is, because you're always going to get an underestimate. I shouldn't say always, but you are frequently going to get an underestimate in these populations, especially in the occupational setting, where people are removed for the workforce or cannot continue in the workforce because of the onset of disease. So that's, I mean, it's important to understand long-term outcome. Like, do they end up with disease? Do they just end up with injury? But also it's so important because you don't want to get an underestimate, right? You want to really understand what's the actual burden here. The other thing is I wrote a note there about point of care devices. Nova Biomedical, for some reason, has become very activated from the top on this. And they're willing to just like dump product on us for those of us who want to use their gear. So write me if you're interested and you have a study you'd like to get going. But they're being unbelievably generous, and I'm not looking at gift horse in the mouths right now.
No, I think, yeah. And I think the important thing also is that there are many companies with point of care devices. I think reproducibility and accuracy are going to be the key things. And again, not to box people into one or another, but just that principle of, if you're going to do something like that, like the saliva test, you know, to pre-run it. Maria Corlata put in a large comment as well.
Mostly around how challenging politically things are in Nicaragua right now. And I know that people from the East Coast, like Yale, Fred Finkelstein, have attempted to provide support to the PD provision, but it's just not been possible because of political concerns.
Yeah, and I think And I think it's important. I mean, Jason made some comments. I mean, yes, it's disingenuous sometimes to provide care, but it's done in part with the humanitarian, but yes, with the business notion. But we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and let's try and figure out how you do deliver safe PD, as has been trying to be done.
100%. Yeah. It needs done, but like the conditions in which it's being implemented in those communities has been a disaster for over 10 years. And if it's a group that's interested in looking at the data we got, this is a number of years ago, it was chilling, and it persists.
So I think that you make a good point. I think what we really need to do, and to Brendan's point, how do we focus on robust, simple data collection that can be done longitudinally? Because I think without that, we're not going to make the cases that we're all so passionate about making, nor make the differences that we want to make in a sustainable way. So, I think the diagram, Brendan, that you wrote about like the ideal study design and then actually what happens, I think this is food for thought. I think it would be nice to look at the different interventions that have been tried in this condition in different locations, and even do a comparative overview, like describes all the different designs and interventions, and what people, and maybe some consensus on what is success. Like, is it hospitalized AKI? Is it less people dying from end-stage kidney disease? Like, what is something easy to measure that may in fact help make the case, right? That doesn't require lots and lots of money and intervention, and where there's an opportunity to infuse resources because the political situation is a little bit better than it is somewhere else, then do a quote unquote more robust study in that location, and then take learnings from it for others. I think there's some interesting things that one can do to try and move the whole enterprise forward. Other people's thoughts? Brendan, did you want to make a comment?
I was going to say, yeah, like Jason sort of said, if there are private companies interested in essentially testing their products, while we need to be wary of the risks of that, you've got potentially unstandardized or not well standardized devices, but equally, if they provide some money and we get some data, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, so perfect here is the enemy of good, as we say, Descartes. But like, it can't be perfect, but it has to be good enough to answer the question. So the more, if we think about it, the more we could have some overarching principles of what is a feasible design, what are feasible to measure outcomes on a cluster basis or individual basis, that might actually help to guide both current and future work. And maybe that's worth a small working group coming up with, much as we did with definitions, much as we did with a minimal data set, like what would be implementable, feasible study designs in different situations, and that might be worth a thought.
And particularly the idea of validating the point of care creatinine or urea as a bridge to being able to do larger studies cheaply.
Yeah, especially with the Nova stuff, just because, and sorry, I'm in a leafy part of DC where they like to cut things down. So sorry about the noise, but it's not perfect, but it's so cheap compared to the Abbott and the other ones. And it, goes right into a smartphone. It seems like it could be kind of a game changer if it's good enough, to the point. And if they're willing to provide the gear at no cost and just ask that we eventually publish something with, using that gear, if that's the trade-off, that seems like a reasonable trade-off. And you just publish potential conflict of interest. We were provided X units by Nova. Think of that what you will, reader. I think it's a real opportunity because they're so key on this. I think they'd be a really good partner. I'm sure there's others. I mean, I don't want to just beat Nova's drum, but they've been.
No, I think it's the concept, right? I think there are a number of these. There's an increasing interest in point of care technology for a number of things, and I think that is a tool, and then you still have to get consensus on, your outcome, and to Brendan's points about, do you want villages and areas or do you want individuals, and what are we trying to actually impact, and there are pros and cons. to those different denominators, if you will. But maybe they're not mutually exclusive. You can do a nested study where you actually look at individuals and you know, like, so there's some really interesting ways that we can think about this, but I'm also conscious of the time, and people committed an hour and we're an hour and 11 minutes over. And I know for Brendan and now it's after midnight, and for Masaomi it's approaching midnight. So I want to be respectful. Shuchi, where do you think we should go from here?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. So I think both issues that were raised during this discussion, one is the type of methodology we can use to, like you said, Adira, generate robust enough data that people pay attention and want to adopt it at a wider scale. The other is looking at outcomes and how would we define. I think Christina made a point about, like, in end-stage kidney disease, it's a longer term outcome, and potentially you need to have some shorter term things that we agree on as potentially relevant to CKDU. So we can sort of think about a smaller working group working on those two topics. Adira, I will work on that. And the other thing that we wanted to ask people, and maybe we'll ask this by email, is for the next webinar, we're perhaps doing shorter presentations in sort of an abstract roundtable with smaller working groups, just so people have a more exposure to the types of studies and the challenges thereof happening in CKDU, right? Potentially inviting people from the observatory. So I'll end there, but thank you so much for the robust discussion. We will send email out for people interested in thinking about interventions. Adira, yes?
Yeah, I just noticed there's some really interesting comments in the chat. I'm going to ask that Sandrine and Maria can actually capture those, synthesize them, and then perhaps for the, like, to echo Shuchi, I think a smaller group that can sort of put together, you know, measurement, endpoints, and interventions into, you know, feasibility buckets, and then study design would be really interesting. And there's no question. And yes, Brendan, I've been to Sri Lanka, and so has Shuchi a few times now. And they are, it's different and the same as Mesoamerica. Let's not underestimate that everywhere there is a politics, which is the reason we haven't solved this yet. And that may be really worthwhile. And yes, we do need to understand mechanisms, but they may be similar or different. And again, there's a lot of opportunities here. So, but I think it's a super fascinating and important humanitarian problem to solve because it's multifaceted. So I think Shuchi already said this, but thank you for your participation, for your interest in trying to solve this. And we really will continue to work with smaller working groups and ongoing review of data and approaches to really try and nail this, at least in my lifetime, because I've been hearing about it and looking at it for the last 20-something years. So it will be very interesting. So all of you have lots of thoughts. So maybe we'll start just a collation of that, Sandrine. So you'll send the comments from here, and then we'll ask people not to reply all, because I think a very long chat can sort of not always work, but to send comments or thoughts to Sandrine. We'll collate, Shuchi and I and others will collate them, and then we'll get back to the group. How does that sound?
Great.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
all.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.